Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Family Treehouse, a podcast series brought to you by Storied, where I chat with people that have a passion for genealogy, storytelling, or both. I am your host, Heather Honert, and today I have a very special guest, David Allen Lambert with American Ancestors. David has been with the organization for more than 30 years. He is their chief genealogist, internationally recognized speaker, published 11 books, my personal favorite, The Guide to Massachusetts Cemeteries, personal favorite. I could go on and on about your amazing accomplishments and resume. Welcome to the show, David. So
I
excited.
am honored. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I've
Impressive.
been doing genealogy for so long. It's the resume keeps on getting bigger and bigger. I joke with my spouse that the eulogy is going to be like days.
Oh, I think it's great. I love it. You just have so much. I could go on all day. That's
Well,
amazing. Love it.
now brevis is perfectly fine.
Well, glad to have you on the show today. Why don't you start by telling our audience about your background and how you got started in family history, storytelling, genealogy in general?
Sure. Well, actually, that's how I got started, was hearing a story.
Yeah.
So we have to go back in time. So I'll be 55 this year. So back when I was 7, the time of the bicentennial in 1976, I was home from school and my grandmother lived with us. And I was very fortunate to have this grandmother who was born in 1896 and whose parents were born in 1848 and 1850. So her parents were teenagers during the Civil War. Her father almost would have served, but he was just a little too young. Um, However, her uncle did serve as a drummer boy in the Civil War, which was a fun story to tell in school, and then told you're a liar and have to bring your grandmother in for show and tell. But I'm digressing. So how I got started, an uncle came over and brought a published genealogy, a book written in 1881 called A Memoir and Genealogy of John Poor. My grandmother's last name was Poor. In fact, her poor father, no pun intended, used to get a lot of business because the shingle outside of his house said A. Poor paper hanger. It was Alexander Poor. And the idea is that they felt bad for him. So they gave him business.
Yeah.
Um, in the book, my uncle was coming in the house. He handed it to me. He was taking his coat off. It was, I think, towards the winter. And I saw something sticking out of it. And of course, being a nosy kid, I pulled it out and it was a metal photograph about 5 by 7, maybe a little bit bigger. And it was made out of tin. And I was intrigued. It was slightly hand painted. And I'd never seen a metal photograph before. So I went over to my grandmother and I said, Nana, Uncle brought this over. Who is this? She goes, oh, that's my father. Well, Heather, at 7 years old, luckily, I had only had a loss of a goldfish.
Yeah.
So the idea that my 80-year-old grandmother had a living father seemed perfectly rational to me.
Yes.
So I said, Nana, can I meet him? And she goes, no, he died in 1921. And I said, well, he was in this book. Why? And she says, well, this is a genealogy of our family that was written before I was born. And she opened it up and she showed me herself, well, not herself, rather her mother, her father, and her oldest siblings, and put the book picture back in. And I said, wow, it tells his entire story. That's pretty small. And she goes, oh, no, his story was bigger than that. In fact, he was on a whaling ship. And that, like, I stopped in my tracks, Heather, because in school, we had just learned in the first grade a child-friendly version of how in Moby Dick, the whale and the whaler became friends.
Yes.
So how amazing could it be? I can go to school now and tell kids that my great-grandfather could have been friends with a whale.
Yeah.
How cool that would have been. So I was, ears perked up. I started asking questions. Within a week, I said, Nana, we have to write a new book. You're not in it. So I started asking her questions. We started writing letters, long before emails and texts, to different nephews and nieces of hers, because she was the youngest. So her nephews and nieces were only 6, 7 years younger than she was.
Yeah.
And so that older generation. And I visited with people, and I was blessed that my grandmother was with me till I was 11. And by the time I was 12, I typed up and created my first 13-page genealogy book. It's like a glorified book report. But at any HGS where I work, it's in the archives because I donated it when I was a teenager.
I love that.
And every so often, someone will drag it out of the archives because the cover has a hand-drawn picture of my great-grandfather. And
Oh.
I needless to say, I'm a better genealogist than I am an artist. So as a kid growing up, instead of climbing trees in my backyard, I trace them and I ask questions about stories. I'm very fortunate because by the time I was 11, all my grandparents were gone. And by the time I was 30, both my parents were gone. And by just a few years after that, all my aunts and uncles were gone.
Yeah.
So if I waited till my 50s to start asking these questions, I'd be simply relying on online, going into cemeteries and doing it the old fashioned way.
Yeah.
But I have the stories. And I think that's truly the most important element of family history is the story of history.
Yeah. Kind of going off that comment you made, next question, what makes that different? Why is storytelling so important versus, having the records? Do you see it equally important, more important? How do you kind of view that?
I think stories are the most important part because one, it sort of knits everything together. I mean, well, I think we're stuck with genealogy. That a lot of online databases and a lot of charts that we buy have space for a name, a date, and a place. Well, I like to, go back to that. I think it's been a song, it's been a poem, the dash. So when I brought my daughters to where my parents are, my oldest daughter was only 3 when my father died, a mother died rather, and 4 when my father died. So she didn't know either of them very well. And my youngest daughter was born after the fact.
Mhm.
And we go to put flowers on the grave, not very far from where I live now. And they ask me, about my parents. And I say, it's more than just these names and these birth dates and death dates. I said, there's the dash, and that's
Yeah.
the story. In fact, my oldest daughter, when she was very little, Heather, I would read her bedtime stories. And then one night she was remembering her papa, who was, like I say, 4 when she died. She goes, what stories did Papa tell you? Honestly, Heather, I couldn't remember my dad reading me a bedtime
Yeah.
story. I remember him telling me funny stories, but probably not any I was going to tell a 4-year-old at that point in
Right.
time. So I I said, well, why don't I tell you a story about Papa? And so it became a bedtime story, then a Papa story, and then a Nana story, and a great grandma story. And by the time she was 7, 8 years old, she could recite them because I would start telling her different elements. She goes, oh, yeah, is that sort of the same story where you talk about Papa being in the war? And, and telling different things about, being on a boat and being seasick, things like that. But it brought life to them again.
Right.
And I think people never truly die as long as we can say their names, but even more so if we know their stories. And I
Right.
think as a family historian and a genealogist, I truly feel like being a sentinel of their memory is what I do. It's
Yeah.
keeping their stories alive for the next generation to hopefully pick up the torch and continue.
Yeah. What When you go to write a story, David, do you have
Mhm.
a process that you use? And I think this is a question that a lot of people struggle with. They don't know how to get started. They've got all those stories, in their head, and they've orally recited them with family members. But how do you go about getting it down, on the proverbial paper?
Sure. Well, I mean, ideally, so at American Ancestors, we originally were the New England Historic Genealogical Society. And we kind of came up with a formula called the register style, which is how we've been publishing the New England Historical and Genealogical Register quarterly since 1847, uninterrupted. And we use this register style, which you can download the template from American Ancestors. This allows you to sort of get the main facts, the primary sources, the name, the birth date and place, the death date, the marriages, and then you add the narrative, the story. So what I suggest to people is put down the hard facts, ones you can back up with records or documents or a gravestone, the birth, the marriage, the death, etc. But then I want you to think of between the dash as to, well, where did they go to school? You're a genealogist. Find out what schools were open in 1905 in that small town in Oklahoma where they lived. See if the school records exist. So you start to build a timeline, hypothetically, even trying to fill in elements that you didn't know or were never told. Now, my grandmother told me a lot of stories, and she was the first to graduate high school. Most of the kids in her family went to work when they were
Mhm.
15, 16 years
Right.
old.
Yeah.
So I contacted where she went to school, and they said, "Oh, I think we have those report cards down in the basement." And they mailed me my grandmother's original report cards from 1909 to 1914.
Oh,
And she was right. She was much better in math than I was. Um, but I get, and now I know what classes she took. So it adds that element. I mean, I think the best gift that we can ever hope our ancestors give us is a journal.
right.
I was honored to one of the books that I've written is the Genealogy for David McCullough. And a poignant point he made at the honoree dinner the book was presented to, he said, if you want to be remembered in the 22nd century, leave a journal in the 21st. And I think that's true that we all have these great intentions of writing a journal down, but then the vanity comes into, well, who's going to want to read it?
Yeah.
During COVID, I kept a journal for 8 months, not knowing what was going to happen.
Right.
And I figured that this is my last story. I'm going to share it.
Yeah.
I also bought a very simple book. Obviously, we, as genealogists, I like to say the great show American Hoarders comes from a home of a genealogist because there's a lot of paper and
Yes.
things that you gather. But I got a book that was a date book, a sort of like anniversaries. And I would write down in this book, not things that had just happened, not just birth dates, but I gave a lecture or I was with Heather on Storied on this date. And I'll put that into this journal
Yeah.
that ideally, if I go to write my own story, which is just as equally as important, because even if you're not somebody's ancestor, you may be a collateral uncle or aunt
Right.
to somebody, your story fits into that whole fabric of family history.
Yeah.
So when I'm writing something, the main facts, then creating a timeline, and then embellishing that information with the primary sources I can back it up with. And from there, I can write their story, even if I don't have them. And this is true for somebody who was born in 1896
Right.
or somebody born in 1696.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. I love the idea of the timeline. I use that a lot myself just to kind of get things into perspective. And I like to do that too, even with historical context, just to give me an idea of things that were happening when, my ancestors were alive to
Mhm.
put a little bit more, credibility to it, I guess.
Exactly.
Um, David, talk to us about, you have journals and things like that, but as far as like tools or resources, like do you keep things, do you just use a regular, Word document, or what kind of tools and resources do you use for the actual putting it on paper?
Well, I mean, obviously, long ago, it was index cards and
Yeah.
just three-ring binders with pedigree charts that were in it. Now, obviously, I've used the technology of a word processor online. So when I write in register format, I can download that template off of the one that I can get from American Ancestors and start writing in that.
Mhm.
So I find that there's more flexibility. And in Word, I could save the document and open it up in something else. And that's not to discredit a genealogy program. I mean,
Right.
Family Tree Maker, Reunion, and all of the ones that are out there have the capability of cross pollination with the GEDCOM. So the GEDCOM file allows them to speak to each other.
Yeah.
But I was always getting a little tired of, oh, I got to update this or I got to update that, or all the data I put into a genealogy program. And again, this is not me being negative in any way. Um, I didn't put a lot of heavy data into it because I found when I did the update or transferred to a GEDCOM, that didn't translate
Right.
across.
Right.
So I use genealogy programs, Heather, to just make the birth, marriage, and death, to produce the charts that I don't want to hand write out every time my cousin's grandchild needs a report for school and they want their family tree the night before.
Right. Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think writing the story down and using Word gives me more flexibility.
Mhm.
And then of course you could use that template to put something online, use it. I mean, I'm on Twitter and, I post things, I don't do the 52 ancestors a year, but I put enough about my ancestors that I think my readers should probably get tired of my relatives. Uh, but It's yeah, I think it gives a little bit more flexibility, at least for me personally.
Yeah. And I think the more that you put it out there, I've had, other guests tell me how, just putting something on a blog or a Twitter post led them to either a story or an ancestor they didn't know anything about by just putting it out there. So I think that's important.
Yeah, I think with the AI technology and with Google, what
Yeah.
amazing. I mean, that's not even let alone to talk. I mean, the things that I've been able to discover with DNA matches
Yeah.
has been unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, so I just feel that we're at the tip of the iceberg, and I hope I get
Yes.
to live another 100 years so I can get 10% of what I want to get done in this field done.
I agree. I think it's going to grow leaps and bounds, even just within the next 10 years, I think.
Absolutely.
David, talk to us about how you use, and you did this a little bit with the report card, and I think that's great. How do you use historical records to help you tell the story of your
Sure.
ancestors?
I mean, obviously, the first part of the analysis is to read it.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times people will find documents, birth, marriages, and deaths. They look up probates, but one thing that they don't analyze and look at are deeds.
Hmm.
Um, Family Search has done a tremendous job, Heather, at least for New England. I can't think of any county in New England that does not have a Family Search deed that I can look up for at least the 17th through the early part of the 20th century.
Hmm.
And we often have people that will ask us, when did my ancestor die? Well, did you look for a probate? I didn't have one, or she didn't have one. But did they have any property? Then you could see the estate of selling the property off, and it might
Right.
say, this is the land of my late father. So that element of deeds that is time consuming because there's no quick and dirty way of just putting in a name, having the deed pop up yet. I mean, indexing is getting better. But if you transcribe out the deed and you use the boundaries, using the fan approach, family, associate, neighbors, to see who are these abutters? Is it a brother-in-law? Is it a father? I mean, for me, a deed was able to connect my great-grandfather to my great-great-grandfather of my paternal surname. It was a deed written at the deathbed of a man in Halifax, Nova Scotia, for land in Cumberland County, Nova Scotia, but finally brought to the registry in Colchester County, Nova Scotia by my great-grandfather in a simple phrase, love and affection to my son.
Hmm.
Deeds and dissecting them and analyzing them and putting them into that timeline, when your ancestors arrived in a community and left a community. Um, I think one of the things a lot of people look at is they transcribe out the last will and testament. But have you ever looked at your ancestors' inventory? And I mean, and sadly, some of our inventories show human property.
Right.
So when I find that, I want to know who they are.
Right.
And I research their stories as well as best as I possibly can. And that's the ones that I want to get out on the internet and show people. I'm like, all right, is this your ancestor? Is there a commonality of location, surname, of family story? Um, Already yet looking at the deeds your ancestor had in their, or looking up the deeds your ancestor had based upon the inventory of his land or her
Mhm.
land
Right.
and seeing where they lived. I mean, nothing spells fun for a family as getting them in the RV and taking them 300 miles to stand in the middle of the Walmart parking lot, Heather, so you could see that's where that house would have stood.
That would be me in a nutshell.
That's me. That's me. My wife would get mad at me. We would go up to northern New Hampshire with maps from the 1870s saying, now the house was here. The graveyard's probably on this dotted road out into the woods. And with a large can of off and bug spray and just and going out there with a machete hacking out the briars, and there's that gravestone. Of course, now she'd say, isn't it on Find a Grave or Billion Graves? Why do we need to go? She's gotten wise.
Oh, my husband has been, he's to the point where if, okay, hey, this cemetery is across this field, he just drops me off. He's like, I'm not going with you. You can do this yourself.
When I was writing the guide to Massachusetts cemeteries, it started us off as a Rolodex when I
Yeah.
worked at the State Archives back in 1987. And my wife and I got married in '88. And it was funny. We would go drive by a cemetery and she'd say, Shall we stop? Is it in your book? So we got a bumper sticker at one point in time that says, I break for cemeteries. I always wanted to do that and drive a hearse, I just think
That's great. Oh, well, I have to ask this question because being a former high school English teacher, I would love to know more about the curriculum that you guys have available for social studies teachers. So tell us about that.
I am delighted to. My colleague Dustin Axe has worked really hard to develop this wonderful curriculum, which is applicable to social teachers. So if you're in a younger classroom setting or an older, it really does have a lot of value. In fact, I was with Dustin recently with Boy Scouts of America. They had a meeting in Cambridge, and we sat down and showed them the curriculum, and it has activities to identify people in history based on making a pack of information, sort of like what would you find in a treasure trunk of genealogy. And then we answered questions that they had about their own family. And I always say, if you get a group of students and you get 20 of them and one or two continue on, what an amazing way you've done to save history. Those
Absolutely.
stories are going to be remembered because it's really our students. I
Yeah.
mean, when I was 7 years old, Heather, if we had this type of curriculum that American Ancestors has now available, I would have excelled even more so in school because I probably would have wanted to teach half the class.
Yes.
I loved history because for me, and you had mentioned this before, I saw not just where my ancestor fit into American history, but world history. And knowing about those facts in social studies and later US history and world history fascinated me. So I excelled in those academic areas in grade school, middle school, and high school. Those are my strongest. And that's probably why I went on to get my BA in history from Northeastern.
Yeah.
But you can find out more about this if you go to American Ancestors and, excuse me, if you go to American Ancestors and you go under our tools, you can find a link to our curriculum page. And you can just fill in your contact information and we'll send you information about it.
Oh, that's awesome. I will definitely, I'll link that
I'll
in the
get you the
show
link.
notes so that, yeah, so everybody can find that easily. That's awesome. So, David, my favorite part of the show is always asking people to tell us about, a favorite family story. And everybody jokes, well, mine's always different, Heather. It's different now than it was, a year ago. But what right now is your favorite family story that you like to tell?
Well, I think that a lot of family stories that I've had, I found more facts than there were when I was told the story.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the things I advise, if I can just toss this out as a little bit of a tip, family stories is so important. And of course, what Story is doing is just mind blowing. It's amazing. And I hope that your listeners that are engaged are actively involved in a storied account. Um, if you take a story and you've heard one version of it, say if you sat on the back porch of your grandparents' house in Maine and you heard this family story and you listened and you can't find any proof of it, well, there may be an ounce of truth in the story. For instance, my great grandfather on the whaling ship. Well, my mother's cousin said that he was on the vessel, the Charles W. Morgan. Well, that's just ironic because the Charles W. Morgan is the last whaling ship that still survives. So I think he put that together and he said, your
Yeah.
great grandfather carved his initials on the vessel. And I'm like, okay, so of course, when I went there on a field trip, I had to look for the initials and stay longer than the rest of the group while looking at all these wooden boards.
Yeah.
But write that down and footnote your story as to who told you it and when. Because in 100 years, the telephone game of genealogy is very, very strange. I mean, I love when people tell me that they know the story that their ancestor was in the Revolutionary War. And, they were a hero and fought alongside George Washington, and then only to find out that their ancestor was never anywhere near Washington and served 2 weeks in Massachusetts and then went home and cared for their fields.
Yeah.
So the idea that if you footnote it, but then go to your other cousins and ask what their variation of the story is. So for me, the best story I have always been interested in the RMS Titanic. I used to correspond with survivors. In fact, one of my dear friends, Melvina Dean, we called her Auntie Melvina because she would send my children Christmas and birthday gifts all the time. She was the last passenger.
Yes.
And I always felt a connect to the Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, recently, when I was researching my great-grandfather, who was in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in World War I found out that he went over on a troop ship, the Olympic, the sister ship of the Titanic, and returned on the Olympic.
Mm-hmm.
But within that story, I learned something, that my grandfather lied. My grandfather claimed to be 18 when he was 15 and joined the Canadian Army. And the story that I proved was one that I had heard. He joined the Army, ran away, and joined the Mounted Rifles of Toronto, fell off the horse, and that's all we had heard. Well, I looked up the record on Archives Canada, and I found that my grandfather did in fact lie to the day of his birth by 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the story goes, he was in the hospital, and his commanding officer came in, and he said, "Jack, you thought that you're going to go over and fight in the trenches and kick some booty of the Germans. Well, the lady that's in the lobby is going to kick your booty all the way home to Toronto. Your mother's here." And so you take the story, so you have a document, and just think, I'm in that window of hearing the story from his children, but I wouldn't have had it if I was, say, his great great grandchild. So writing this down, taking the oral tradition as one fact, footnoted, and then have the hard evidence. And in some cases, Heather, we don't find the proof, but still write it down, because your version of the story at least is concrete to a certain year, a person, and a place.
Sure.
And that could change. The telephone game we played when we were kids, add that by generations, and those stories twist all over the place.
They sure do. They sure do. That's a great story.
Thank you.
I think that just, no matter what, just getting it written down is the key to the game, that so many people don't do. I think they worry about it being perfect or, grammatically correct and things like that. And personally, I don't care what it looks like. If I had something written from an ancestor 100 years ago, I would be thrilled.
Same.
No matter what.
Same.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that people tend to do is I think they keep the blinders on of looking for their direct ancestors. You need to
Yes.
look at the siblings of your ancestors, even
Yeah.
the first cousins. So when I go to the National Archives, I'm looking for pensions and military records for the cousins of my great grandparents, that fought in the Civil War or the Revolutionary War, because affidavits within those type of documents often written by family members, and you may get a different spin on a family story. But I think the one thing I have to tell people, don't be just concerned about your ancestors, concerned about yourself.
Yeah.
The best storyteller of your story is yourself.
Right.
And why let history be the one that loses facts of it? Write your own story down. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not vanity. I would love to have opened up a time capsule for my great grandfather on the whaling ship and learning about all of his whole life.
Yeah.
I have facts that I found. I have a limited timeline, but it breathes life into him. If you can breathe life into your own story while you're alive and put it in your safety deposit box, or put it on story, or put it out online, you're giving your family a treasure they'll never, ever put down.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot as a team at Storied, about how important it is that you're telling right now, because in 10 years it is going to be history. So get it written down, no matter what. David, as we finish up here, do you have any last minute tips or tricks or pieces of advice or wisdom? You have been full of it today. So do you have any other tips, tricks you'd like to leave with our audience?
Well, I think the idea of sharing your story is important. I've never known a genealogist to become a millionaire overnight by publishing their story. The idea of preserving it and assigning a person in your family to be your academic, where are your papers going? I give a great talk that's well received. I personally feel it's good, called "What Time Is It on Your Genealogical Clock?" I mean, are you looking to eventually publish a book? Well, create a timeline. After being an author of a number of books myself, you may not have that editor breathing down your neck. You're your own editor, but
Right.
put a calendar in your office or your study where you work in your genealogy and say, by this point in time, I want to have these 2 chapters done.
Right.
And set a timeline, because at American Ancestors, we have over 28 million manuscripts, and many of them are the genealogies people intended to write.
Yeah.
And the hardest story I hear is when I find out that an older member has died and their family has gone in and cleaned the apartment. And now it's all on ancestry.com, or it's all on this chart she printed on the wall. And I've seen so many family treasures get lost
Yes.
because like a place to put it. American Ancestors is one of those places. It may
Yeah.
be your local historical society. It may be your great niece who has an interest and is asking you all those questions. But don't lose what you've worked so hard to gather.
Yeah.
It's the worst crime, I think, is committed when people toss away family history. But if you can pull it together, even if it's online, or even write it up, make something of it, or find someone who will carry on your legacy. And that's the best tip I can give. That way your work isn't lost.
Yeah, great advice. I think that is wonderful. I think so many people worry that no one's going to do anything with it, and there are always avenues out there like American Ancestors. So good tips. Well, David, thank you for your expertise and your passion for our field. I am very honored that you spent time with me today. So thank you for that.
Well, Heather, I look forward to seeing you and some of your listeners at our Roots Tech. I've
Yes.
got 4 lectures. I believe you said you also have a few yourself
Yes. Looking
coming
forward
up.
to it.
It's going to be a great conference. I'm looking forward to seeing my my friends and distant cousins, as I'm finding I have more 10th cousins at Roots Tech than I would have thought. My holiday gift card list is getting huge every day.
Oh, well, I'm excited to see you and everyone else there. And thank you again for spending time with me today.
It's an honor. Thank you for having me.
Until next time, friends, embrace the power of your family's untold tales and embark on a journey of discovery. Let the ink flow and the words dance as you weave together the threads of your ancestors' lives. Start writing your stories today and let their voices echo through the generations to come at storied.com. Have a great day. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Family Treehouse, where we celebrate the power of storytelling and preserving our family legacies. Storied is more than just a platform for sharing stories. Dive into those historical records and newspapers, discovering the hidden gems that bring your ancestors to life. Add branches to your family tree, connecting the dots between generations. Thank you for joining us on this storytelling journey. Your stories matter, and through Storied, they have the power to resonate across time and touch the hearts of generations to come. Keep uncovering your family's history and keep the spirit of storytelling alive with Storied.